I think we're going to get going with the really fun subject of Kent Presents. We're going to have a really cool graphic up here, which I think will make everyone here feel very good, because as of last year, I think it needs to be updated, but as of last year, North Korean intercontinental missiles could not reach Kent, Connecticut. So from that, I think we can take some optimism. I can't say the same thing about Denver, Colorado, or certainly not about California. But anyway, North Korea policy has a sense of sort of being Groundhog Day. I mean, you've got successive administrations dealing with the issue. According to our current president, it was the idea that they all did things the same way, expecting a different result. And lo and behold, North Korea has continued on this path toward deliverable nuclear weapons. So I think the president tried very hard to do things completely differently in order to get a different result. But so far, I think it's pretty clear he's done things very differently, and I think we'll have a discussion about how differently that was. But he's also getting the same result. So I think we're going to have this problem will be around for some time. I had hoped that as of when I was doing this, I worked on it for 4 years. I had hoped that when the Rosens went to North Korea back in '07, it would have been all taken care of. Donna would have made very clear, come on guys, you've got to get with the program. But alas, it's continued. So in late, I'm going to kind of set the stage for where we are, and then we're going to turn to this very distinguished panel. And before I set the stage, let me briefly introduce, because I think you've got some materials. You certainly know Ambassador Nick Burns, had been our ambassador in NATO, our ambassador in Greece, or the former Ottoman Millet of Greece. Is that what they call it? Or?
2 centuries ago.
2 centuries, okay.
Yeah.
And Nick was also Undersecretary of Political Affairs in the State Department during the Condi Rice period at the State Department, and very much familiar with nuclear negotiations, as he was part of the effort at that time with Iran, but also part of the effort with India. So I think we have really one of America's most distinguished diplomats who has kind of the broad gamut of issues, and he's a member of Red Sox Nation. Full disclosure, I am too, and I would say that kind of unifies the panel, because the next person is David Sanger. David was the Tokyo bureau chief, knows a lot about the issues in North Korea, has written extensively, and most recently has written about cyber war in his most recent book, Perfect Weapon. And I think we'll have some comments about our efforts on North Korea. David often refers to diplomatic efforts as failed efforts. So I come back with the failing New York Times, so we've decided not to do that.
It's a little bind between us, it's sort of like the one thing we've got going, that and the Red Sox.
Yeah. Exactly. And the fourth Red Sox fan up here is Dr. John Park, who handles he is in charge of the Korea Working Project at the Belford Center at Harvard, where Nick is also a professor there. John is quite the expert on a lot of these issues involving sanctions, how much they've hurt, how much they've been improperly implemented. He's also done work on Korea People's Army, KPA, that is the North Korean Army, and the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Army, and the kind of collusion. There is collusion there, I think, that they've had there. And of course, now collusion between the Chinese Communist Party and the North Korean Workers' Party. So I think John brings a lot of expertise, so we're very pleased to have him as an unadvertised special here. So let me just very briefly state where this problem has gone. You recall we were talking about Little Rocket Man last fall. We were talking about, my button is bigger than your button. A lot of the stuff that, frankly speaking, was not getting us anywhere. But one aspect of what the Trump administration was doing was indeed getting us somewhere, and that was the sanctions program. They had gone further with UN-approved sanctions, and it's important to have UN-approved sanctions, because if one country has a sanction and another country doesn't, then you really don't have a sanction. But I think the Trump administration had been successful in pushing through additional sanctions, and most importantly, getting China really on board for something that was long overdue, that is going after North Korea's refined petroleum products. That is, this is a country that is producing multi-stage missiles. They're producing, we believe, nuclear warheads at this point. They have a active plutonium program. They have what we believe to be an active uranium enrichment program, but they cannot refine gasoline. So when China stepped forward and began to do that, there was a sense that, you know, the squeeze may be on. And sure enough, on January 1st, which is a time when a North Korean leader usually makes this sort of blood-curdling statement about the state of the peninsula and the state of the world, Kim Jong-un, interestingly, kind of shifted gears, and he talked about a desire for better relations, better external relations. The South Koreans were on it in a New York minute. They went right at the North Koreans and said, hey, can we work on this? And within days, we had a North Korean Olympic team. Sadly, it involved taking 5 North Korean hockey players and kicking out 5 South Korean hockey players, women's hockey players. The South Korean women's hockey players were not very happy, and then the South Korean prime minister said, well, we're going to lose anyway. So that didn't go well, but overall, North Korea was able to kind of get a seat at the Olympic table. And then the North Koreans said something to the South Koreans that they've said for decades, which is, our leader would like to meet with the American leader. South Koreans said, we'll carry that message. So they flew to Washington. They went into General McMaster's office. He was the national security advisor at the time. President Trump, hearing that this was happening, came to the South Korean delegation, said, no, come on into the Oval Office. They sat at the Oval Office and they said to the president that Kim Jong-un would like to meet with you. And the president said, sounds like a good idea to me. Whereupon we had this unusual, Nick, I think you would agree with me that diplomatically it was a little unusual to have the South Koreans come out and announce a meeting between the North Korean leader and President Trump. And then we went into full implementation mode. Now, usually in a summit, and I think Nick will speak to this as well. In a summit, you try to get everything kind of nailed down so that when they finally sit down, they can talk about the Red Sox or, as I said earlier, about each other's haircuts. But it was pretty clear that the president didn't really want to do this traditional preparation, this traditional sort of spade work to get ready for a summit. Because after all, to do the same thing again, not that we've ever had a summit before, would be to yield the same desultory results. So the consequence was the president went into Singapore and with really very little on paper. And so at a certain point, and I was very aware of this because I was up at 3 in the morning on MSNBC, and the 2 leaders came out to sign something. And the anchor said to me, what are they signing? And I said, beats the heck out of me, because nobody had done any briefing on what exactly they were going to sign. Now, normally, you'd give out to the press, this is something they're going to sign. It's embargoed till 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. Singapore time, but this is what they're going to, and then you'd have a set of talking points riffing off of the actual document. Zero. But fortunately, our president has this habit of first he signs something, and then he holds it up. So some enterprising Japanese journalist took a picture of it with his iPhone, and then soon we were able to get the text within about minutes, so we knew what they had signed. And for those of us, you know, it would be funny, except it's true. So anyway, we looked at this, and lo and behold, it had a reference to denuclearization, but no reference to when it would be accomplished. There was no time frame. And so the North Koreans have, well, you can take it either one of two ways. You know, communists have this theory that the state will eventually wither away. No time frame on that. And then if you read the Bible carefully, you have this idea of the lambs lying down with the lions. No sense of when that's going to happen either. By the way, there's a museum in Israel where they have a lion lying down with a lamb, and I asked the guy, how do you get that? How do you do that? And he said, well, we bring in a different lamb every day. So anyway, there was no sense of when this was going to happen. But then the president did a couple of other things that were quite amazing. He talked about the need for a peace treaty. And what's that about? And that is kind of North Korean speak for the idea that we are threatening North Korea, threatening to invade them. That's why they need nuclear weapons. And gosh, if only we can show our goodwill and the fact that we don't have a hostile policy, then they could give up their nuclear weapons. So the president went to the line, well, we'll do a peace treaty. Now, people who've looked at this stuff before acknowledge this has all been there before. So far, we're in kind of 100% lockstep with stuff that's been done, except less. And then finally, of course, the president got up and he told the world that, and again, this showed after 45 minutes, he's speaking North Korean because we've always used the term joint exercises, but the president got up and called them provocative war games. And so what has happened for decades is North Koreans sit in front of Americans, they've done it to me, and they say, and we would like you to cancel your provocative war games, which strike great concern among our people, even though we can eviscerate you, et cetera. So they did that with the president. He said, done, we'll take care of it. So he's given up the joint exercises. And by the way, a military alliance without exercises is not much of an alliance. You need your two forces to be able to work together, et cetera. So at that, and then he said, oh, by the way, and the president said at his press conference, by the way, I'd like to get all our troops back home. So I think there's a problem here where we've given up a lot, and then the question is, what have the North Koreans done? Now, in the document, it said Secretary Pompeo will immediately start negotiating, and on the North Korean side is, we'll think of someone to meet with Secretary Pompeo. So they hadn't even named a negotiator. So we come out of Singapore with a very unclear way forward. Secretary Pompeo went to Pyongyang and said, okay, can we start with a declaration of what your nuclear programs are? No declaration. He even suggested maybe we could get some warheads. No chance of that. So I would say we're kind of at the beginning. And the question, of course, is can we get the sanctions going and can we get back to some diplomacy that will be effective? And I'm going to close by saying I think we have a lot of options here. We do not have the option of saying, okay, North Koreans, we give up, you can have nuclear weapons. It's very dangerous. It has proliferation implications. It has a lot of implications around the world. So we need to deal with this. And one of the first things we need to talk about is diplomacy in the region. We need to get some of these sanctions back. We need to reestablish some credibility on this issue with the North Koreans and show that we are not going to leave this issue alone. And North Korea needs to understand that if they allow this to go on, we are going to be every step of the way doing things to make their lives miserable as long as they pursue nuclear weapons. So, with those kind of opening comments, let me turn to the panelists. And Nick, why don't I start with you and how you see, first of all, the diplomacy and where the diplomacy might go from here.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Chris. And it's nice to be back in Kent. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try to be brief because I want to hear from David and John as well. John's my colleague at Harvard Kennedy School. David's a longtime friend. I just say this, first of all, I think all of us would agree that North Korea remains the #1 national security problem of the United States. That's what Barack Obama told President-elect Trump when they had that one meeting in the Oval Office in the White House in December of 2016. And let me say as well, I think President Trump was right to turn towards diplomacy. You remember where we were. I was on this stage with Henry Kissinger last year with Michael interviewing us, and we were really concerned about the prospect of a war. And I don't know anyone who knows a lot about the U.S. military in South Korea, North Korea, who believes that a war, that a military solution was possible. Every war game that they looked at was going to be potentially catastrophic if it was a conventional war or, God forbid, a nuclear war. So the president was right to turn towards diplomacy. I even think, and I said multiple times to people like David, I thought the president was right to go meet Kim Jong-un. As a former career diplomat, I always think we're better off confronting our adversaries, trying to learn as much as we can about them, delivering tough messages. I thought the president had an opportunity to do that. That's as much as I can say in a positive vein about the president, because I think he mishandled Singapore. As we look back at Singapore, to me it was almost like what we've come to expect of the president, a reality TV performance. It was a photo op, and it was really nothing more than that. The statement that Chris referred to contained 4 points, and those 4 goals, and the only goal that's been met, none of the denuclearization goals have been met, is the return of some of our remains from the Korean conflict more than 60 years ago, which is very important. It's been a long-held goal of ours, but it's not really pertinent to the nuclear issue. It was an add-on at the end.
And by the way, something we were doing as of 10 years ago.
We've been doing it for a long time.
Until Donald Rumsfeld cut it off.
Yeah. So I think it was a missed opportunity. When you go into a summit like this, you do want it to be well prepared. You want to have thought out 20 moves down the chessboard, what your opponent's going to do, how you're going to counteract the opponent's moves. We've seen little of that from President Trump. What we had going for us in 2017 and into this year was that China was essentially with us in trying to restrain the North Koreans from continuing with their nuclear program. They had actually done some work on sanctions, which had surprised us, and it was positive. The South Koreans, the Japanese, most of the rest of the world was with us, but when President Trump had this substanceless summit in Singapore, he thereby encouraged the South Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese to begin normalizing their own economic and political relations with the North Koreans, and that's exactly what's happened. So in effect, in diplomacy, you have leverage over your opponent. You try to use that leverage against the opponent. The president, I think, has given away most of it, because what's happened? The North Koreans have not even identified the complete list of where their nuclear facilities and fissile material are located. That's a first step. The North Koreans, if you read David Sanger's very good reporting, which I reread this morning, are developing a new reactor at Yongbyon, which is going to be more powerful than the previous. The North Koreans continue to produce fissile material, one of the ingredients of a nuclear weapon. The North Koreans continue to work on their ballistic missile capacity. And so Kim received the legitimacy of sitting down with the American president, which no American president since Eisenhower had wanted to give the North Koreans. He emerged from his isolation. He's now traveling around the world. His father and grandfather did not do that. He did not do that in the first years of his reign as the authoritarian leader of North Korea. He is substantially better off today than he was the day before Singapore, and we are substantially worse off. And it leaves us with very few weapons. We can increase our own sanctions, but if you don't have Chinese sanctions, and China is 90% of North Korea's trade with the rest of the world, then you don't really have leverage. So I think we've been outpointed. And it's unfortunate. The only thing I can say is Joe Yun, whom all of us know, very distinguished former American diplomat, he was our chief negotiator between 2016 and 18, now retired. He wrote a piece for the Washington Post saying maybe the best we can do is open liaison offices, an American liaison office in Pyongyang, a North Korean liaison office. This is below the level of an embassy. It's below formal diplomatic relations, just so that you can begin to work the North Koreans directly on a day-by-day basis. Boy, it's a small step. It doesn't get you very far. So I worry that we've given away a lot of what was going for us, and we don't have an international coalition supporting us. Final point. We also had a lot of leverage over Iran, the other great challenge to the United States on the nuclear front. We've just given that away. Because whether you like the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama negotiated 3 years ago or not, at least it had bottled the Iranians up until 2030 on its plutonium and uranium enrichment lines, the 2 lines to a nuclear weapon. We had all the world with us. and we've given that away too. So if you just widen the aperture a little bit, I think we're substantially worse off in trying to constrain both North Korea and Iran.
Could I just say one thing about the liaison office, because the Chinese love that idea because it worked for our relationship with China.
Yeah, and with North Korea, actually, North Vietnam, Vietnam in the 90s.
So the Chinese came to me and said, would you be willing to open liaison offices with the North Koreans? So I go back to Washington. You may recall the discussions. Everyone was, oh, we don't want to do that. Secretary Rice said, that's not a bad idea. And she sold it to the president, who was very aware of how it had jump-started the China relationship. The next time I met with the North Koreans, it was in Berlin. I said, I have great news for you. We are prepared to open a liaison office where you will have an office. It'll look really, frankly, like an embassy in Washington, and we will have something in Pyongyang. And Kim Jong-un said, no, we're not interested in that. I said, you sure you're not interested? No, we don't want that. And I must say, anyone who's looked at an American embassy with the bristling antennas on the roof, I can see why maybe they contain their enthusiasm about it. But the problem with the North Koreans is they seem to want something until they don't. And the other point, they always seem to want what they don't really want. So, David, what can we do to deal with this, not in the diplomatic area, but between war and peace? There is some room, and what could we do?
Well, first, I agree with everything that we've heard here from both Chris and Nick about what happened in Singapore. I was there with the press group that followed the president and Kim Jong-un there. I think their view of it was slightly more optimistic than what you saw when you were on the ground, which is to say that after the president emerged from that, and the statement, as you said, was very brief. In fact, when I got my leaked copy of the statement, I called an American official and I said, this must just be the talking points. It can't be the statement. And they said, no, that was the statement. Yeah, right. Because it did have less in it. There have been previous agreements, including the 1992 agreement between North and South Korea, and subsequent agreements that actually went into more detail about when denuclearization would happen and how. And this didn't have it. That said, I think it was a very good idea for the president to meet with Kim. I think he was right to have the instinct that decisions in North Korea happen from the top down, and that if our old approach was to go deal with second and third and fourth tier North Koreans and then expect it to bubble up, that wasn't necessarily going to work. So if he went into it highly prepared and ready to have a detailed agreement with the kind of specificity that you saw in, or on the way to the specificity that you saw in the Iran deal, then I think it could have actually been a useful process. We kept writing, and it kept angering the White House that President Trump would have to emerge from this with a deal that was clearly better and more detailed and resulted in deeper denuclearization than was in the Iran deal, which, of course, he rejected as a horrible deal. Well, if you could get a fraction of the Iran deal for North Korea, we wouldn't even be having this panel, right? I mean, the North Koreans actually have 20 to 60 nuclear weapons, depending on whose estimates in the U.S. intelligence world you believe. I'm sort of in the dead middle of that, and I think, Chris, from something you and I were on a few weeks ago, I think you're probably about the same. So we're estimating they've probably got about 40. The fact that we don't know is a big problem, because if the North Koreans said, we're ready to go denuclearize, and here is our declaration, and here are our 25 nuclear weapons, the first thing everybody would say is they must be hiding another 15 someplace. And that's why that statement detailing all of their weapons, all of their production facilities, all their fissile material, all their missile launching sites, how many missiles they have, how many of the mobile missile carriers they have, is a critical starting point. And Secretary Pompeo went a few months ago, or a month ago, right after the Singapore summit, to sit down and say, great, let's start with the declaration. And the first thing they got back was, oh, no. First, you have to start with a declaration that the hostilities of the Korean War are over. And that's the impasse they're in right now, because President Trump, having given up the military exercises or war games, and telling us during the press conference that they were way too expensive to conduct, and he hated them. By the way, they were about the same price as his parade, which just got put off. Okay.
That's not fair.
It's true.
fair.
I know.
It's fair.
It's a cheap shot. We're trying
it's
to
fair.
be nice.
I'm just giving comparative numbers here in a neutral way, Chris. I don't understand what you're saying. Having given that up, then moving on to do the declaration of the end of hostilities would mean that the United States would have given the North Koreans two of the big things that they've been looking for without getting step one from them on denuclearization. So what else can we do? So in the book we were discussing at the session yesterday, The Perfect Weapon, there's a chapter called Left of Launch, which describes a program that the United States did not keep terribly secret, about how to try to defeat North Korea's missiles without attacking them, without bombing them, and thus without starting up a war. And this was ordered by President Obama, or ordered to be accelerated by President Obama in 2014, when the North Koreans were beginning to rev up their launching capability. It was January, February of 2014. And the idea was to get in and actually interfere with the launch process before it happens, because that way you don't have to rely on our missile defenses, which is good because our missile defenses work about 1 out of 2 times under perfect test conditions. And President Obama thought that was an undue risk. This program worked, or appeared to work, for a while. The North Koreans had an 88% failure rate with their Musadan missile tests. We don't think that every one of those failures was related to the U.S. program. There was a lot of bad engineering. Mike Pompeo, when he was CIA chief, publicly acknowledged that the U.S. was doing what it could to get inside the North Korean supply chains. So, you know, we've obviously done what we could to feed them some bad parts. The difficulty came that in October of 2016, when most people in this room were focused on other things that were going on in the country, the North Koreans actually stopped launching. They suspended the Musadan program and rolled out an entirely new and different design for missiles, and that's what was launching successfully last year.
Hwasong.
That's right. So the President Trump has rightly said that we have now gone probably around 250 days without a North Korean missile test or a North Korean nuclear test. And that's a good thing, because we don't think that they have yet solved the Kent problem, which is, how do you get a missile that can reach as far as Kent, Connecticut? Just high up on their list. And so the longer that they can't test, the longer there'll be an uncertainty that they actually know how to have a warhead re-enter the atmosphere and get in. So anything the president is doing to slow that diplomatically or using covert action seems to be worthwhile. The problem is, all of these are somewhat ephemeral solutions. They don't last for that long. And we have to go into it with that understanding. And at any moment, the North Koreans could say, well, you're not giving us our peace declaration, so we're going to resume testing. And that's their leverage back.
John, the relationship between North Korea and China was often described as close as lips to teeth. Are we back to that? And are we going to be able to get China back on a tough sanctions regime?
Thank you. First off, it's wonderful to be here. This is a fantastic gathering. I'm going to a dinner party in Manhattan later tonight. I feel I'm armed with great talking points and great material from my 2 days here. One of the key things right now is that the China-North Korea relationship is either overestimated or underestimated. There's very little calibration. And to address your question, the map is fantastic, because when we look at it from this perspective, we lose the granularity. If you zoom in this area, it's a story of 3 Chinese provinces bordering North Korean provinces that I am wary of making geographic comparisons, but function very similar to Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is a sub-regional phenomenon. Free movements of goods and people going across has led to a situation where below the radar, the relationship between China and North Korea introduces new options and capabilities to this third generation of the Kim regime. So 3 points that I want to quickly highlight is that it's important to view North Korea not as a country, but as a 1% phenomenon and as a 99% phenomenon. The research that we do predominantly focuses on that 1%. And if you think of that 1% as North Korea Incorporated, a small elite group of elite state trading companies operating the Chinese marketplace, the question is, and the puzzle is, how the heck did they get there? How the heck are they doing their work? And in many respects, this is the story of sanctions. The vast majority of research and what we read about sanctions is in the primary space. Sanctions do hurt, sanctions do work, but no one really looks at it in terms of secondary and tertiary spaces. And there, sanctions look a lot like antibiotics. And the 1% in the North Korean regime and this subset of the group that are inside the Chinese marketplace looks like a superbug. They have been affected adversely by sanctions. They've fallen down, and in getting back up, they've learned new techniques. And something that's troubling for all of us and should be worrying for all of us is that they've innovated. And in innovating, they've developed commercial channels that in the vast majority of their activities are very benign, nothing to do with criminal activity. But if you look at these commercial channels, they're like a dual-use technology. You know, if you define technology as a set of practices, these practices are for commerce. But once you build that commercial channel, you can then move illicit goods between. And here I think it's a story of the electronics, circuitry, other things that go into the advanced components of what startled all of us last year. North Korea we were watching all of these activities very closely. The intelligence community said that North Korea would be 5 to 7 years away from these capabilities. In some instances, these estimates have been around for 25 years, so you have to revisit this 5 to 7 year time period. But the notion that they were breaking these technical thresholds, and in July of last year, they did it in a matter of weeks. That's the piece where I think the commercial aspect and going back to this relationship between these actors on the Chinese and North Korean side are critical. The final thing I'd mention here is who are these actors? They don't just appear. A lot of it is from the function of party-to-party relationships with the origins, connections between the two militaries. Now it's back to the party-to-party level. And the patterns are very troubling. Every time Kim Jong-un meets with either President Moon of South Korea or President Trump, just before that summit, he meets with President Xi Jinping, not as in the capacity of President Xi Jinping, Chairman Kim, but as the head of their respective parties. And so that's an element where there are a number of things going on. But one thing to look at when it comes to the operationalization of that relationship, you build political relationships, and then for the actors below, you monetize those political relationships. So there is a lot to be said about these kind of commercial deals that merit further investigation.
John, could you speak a little also to the question of the South Korean relationship with North Korea? Because that's not going away. We've seen that they're going to have another summit, and they're going to have combined teams of the Asian Games. Are we doing enough with Moon Jae-in to make sure the relationship with us is closer than his relationship with North Korea?
So one thing about Ambassador Hill's time when he was heading up the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks is a multilateral effort to peacefully denuclearize North Korea, the big package deal, incorporating denuclearization, diplomatic recognition, economic concessions. Ambassador Hill became, I think, global services with United Airlines, going back and forth in tremendous of travel, coordination. That coordination is absent right now. What we're looking at is a series of bilaterals done top-down, these summits. In the case of South Korea, the South Korean government under President Moon Jae-in is clearly looking to maximize their national interests. And the maximization of that is to address the security issues, to manage it, but to use this period right now to advance inter-Korean goals. And some would say inter-Korean dreams. And so what we're seeing with President Moon is a big focus on inter-Korean transportation infrastructure projects, not designed to primarily benefit North Korea, but to benefit South Korea. And the idea is if you can connect South Korea, which is like an island economy, to the landmass of China and beyond, you essentially have the type of greater prosperity and reconciliation. And through that, you would have the addressing of security issues and denuclearization. But the biggest difference is that the South Korean formulation of this is a very organic, incremental type of approach, where denuclearization in practice becomes secondary, where the US approach is fundamentally different. Denuclearization first, then other benefits come later.
Nick?
Chris, I just wanted to add to what John and David have said. I think the problem we have here, if you're trying to predict probability of success for the United States, it's very low. And it's low for an essential reason, elementary reason. We have no agreed framework with the North Koreans on what we're trying to do. Normally in a negotiation, especially if you put your president to a summit meeting, you have a very detailed agreement on what we are trying to accomplish together. You may not get there eventually, but at least you know what the rules of the road are. Here's what the Americans think they're doing, President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, to North Korea. You will denuclearize, you'll dismantle all of your nuclear facilities, and then we'll talk about whether or not, as David Sanger said, there's going to be a cessation of hostility. There's going to be a peace treaty that would tie up the loose ends from the Korean conflict, and that the United States would lift its sanctions, and that we might return to diplomatic relations. That's what the U.S. thinks it's doing. The North Koreans, as David said, we're doing something completely different. Yeah. You're going to give us all those things, release of sanctions and a peace treaty and normal diplomatic relations and trade, and then we'll talk about denuclearization. Yeah. Obviously, I think the first approach is the better approach to the United States. Yeah. I do. I agree with President Trump, but he didn't get that job done with Kim Jong-un at Singapore, so shame on us. Yeah. And this, to me, means that I think we're looking at a negotiation that's going to go nowhere because we don't have people on our side, the South Koreans or the Chinese, to help us get there.
Okay. We're going to go to Q&A. There are a couple of microphones, but so while people are getting up there, let me turn to David. And David, before you make your point, I just want to know, do you think this is a good time for a trade war with China? I mean, I've been looking at my calendar, and I couldn't quite figure out a good date for it, but I just know that this doesn't seem like a good time.
Well, I also think President Trump probably doesn't feel that way because last summer he said, why would I impose sanctions on China when I need them on North Korea? So now we've imposed sanctions on China when he needs them on North Korea. The point I was going to make is, Nick is absolutely right that if you listen to President Trump or you read the tweets, the North Koreans have to give up all this stuff and then we will go do our thing. The North Koreans are listening very carefully to what the US government says. And Secretary Pompeo has been walking back that strategy for a few months now. It's hard to get American officials to say the words CVID, which they used to use all the time, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. In fact, we sort of taunt them along during press conferences on this and say, well, of course, your formal policy on this is complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. And they talk around it. The second thing is Secretary Pompeo recognizes and has said to people at various moments who he has met, he recognizes there's going to have to be some give and take. But the White House won't admit to that because that's the way the previous strategies were done. Right. I can't see how you get there at this point without some of that. We're going to do this gradually. Yeah. And I agree with Nick. In the end, if you're Kim Jong-un and you're looking at the world, what happens to you if you actually give up all of your nuclear weapons? You're a goner. So it makes perfect strategic sense for him to give up something, let the president declare, as he declared the day after Singapore, the nuclear threat from North Korea is over, which, of course, gave the Chinese and the Russians and everybody an opportunity to back away.
Okay, yes, sir.
Mr. Sanger just spoke to exactly my question. Why on earth would the North Koreans want to give these up? Is that a realistic objective? Should containment be the U.S. objective?
I'd like to take a quick whack at that, which is to say we cannot allow them to have nuclear weapons. That means we should go after them anywhere we can find them. We should be arresting North Koreans when we can. We should be interdicting their trade. We should be trying to make life miserable for them such that they will come to understand that they can give up weapons and get something in return. I think that's the right approach, but it needs some pretty deft diplomacy, and it can't just be us. Nick, do you want to?
Sometimes in a negotiation, you can rely on the good faith of the interlocutor. In this case, we can't. Here's a regime that's been lying, cheating. They've never met a deal that they haven't reneged on. So we have to have a very tough approach here. And President Bush and President Clinton didn't succeed, but they were tough approaches. This is a very soft approach.
Yeah.
I don't see how it's going to work with a guy like Kim.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
We've been sort of programmed to think of him as a crazy guy with bad hair, and we have our own crazy guy with bad hair, and except that he's killed people. Now that he's out and about, do we have a different perception of his mental capacity, of his power? Is he a one-man band? What's the thinking? Has it changed about him?
David, you were in Singapore.
Well, what I find interesting is that when Kim Jong-un first took office, and you remember his father died somewhat unexpectedly, for the first year, we were writing stories about U.S. Intelligence assessments that suggested that he was considered to be, sort of wet behind the ears, and the military wasn't going to stand for it and all that. Well, then he went about executing most of his rivals, including his I guess was father-in-law, right?
Uncle.
Uncle, I'm sorry, who was in a business with the Chinese he didn't care for and other things. He's pretty well established himself quite well. The assessments have now completely reversed. Sort of interesting, John made reference before to our wrong assessments about how long it would take them to get to the intercontinental ballistic missile stuff. In fact, President Trump was given a series of assessments that wouldn't happen for a number of years, and happened in the first 6 months he was in office. But also the assessments on Kim have reversed. The one thing I think we have going for us is he's 33, 34 years old now. If you think about how long his grandfather lived, he could be running the country for another 50 years. So he's got to be thinking in terms of long-term economics to some degree to stay in place. And he may be a much more rational actor than we've given credit.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about proliferation, but often in the discussion about proliferation, people talk about their worries of North Korea proliferating. But I mean, we don't really see that other than, they gave some chemical weapons to Syria. My question is more about proliferation to North Korea, right? How they've gotten a lot of these things. They got the nuclear technology from the Pakistanis, and then the Hwasong, which you mentioned, is actually a Ukrainian missile, right? Or a Ukrainian engine, at least. And the
According to the
Ukrainians
New York
also,
Times, it's Ukrainian.
If you
right?
believe the failing New York Times, it came right out of a Ukrainian factory, yes.
The Ukrainians also let the Chinese get the aircraft carrier, right? So is our attention just too focused on North Korea and that thought? Is any attention being given to especially FSU areas, these third countries where there are all these technologies lying around that then, now we're talking about North Korea, tomorrow it could be Iran or it could be Saudi Arabia as there's an arms race. What's being done or what should be done to counter that?
John, you've done a lot of work on Chinese military, North Korean military cooperation. Why don't you take it away?
So from a historical standpoint, to your exact question there, after the Cold War, there was a big effort. And Senator Lugar, Senator Nunn, a bipartisan program was designed to make sure that there was a program in place to prevent the proliferation, not only the technology, but the know-how. Over time, there has been a tremendous growth and sophistication in the marketplace for these type of items. So you referenced the AQCON network as well. The piece that I think is really remarkable is the China-North Korea connection, where this isn't state or party driven per se, but with the North Korean state trading company elements embedded in the Chinese marketplace, they can pretty much procure anything, but done through market mechanisms. They literally put out a tender, we want this type of item. Chinese companies bid for that, and the North Korean manager there would select the winning bid. So it's that type of piggybacking off of commercial, as I mentioned, commercial channels. That's the part that's troubling, and if you diagnose that, then we have to figure out what kind of treatment options do we have. Without that diagnosis, though, I think that largely continues to go under-examined and then under-addressed.
All right, we're getting into the lightning round here because I just got one of these signs from the side. So why don't we do all three questions, sir? Go ahead.
So I'd like to try and link yesterday's cyber talk to the diplomatic implications. If we are losing leadership and underspending in cyber, is there a sort of equivalent of a Moore's law of cyber that will say we will fall further behind faster? And if we do that, what are the implications for diplomatic activity in North Korea?
All right. Okay, and that will go to David, but while he's thinking, go ahead.
Obviously, nuclear deproliferation is the ultimate goal, but where, this is more of a question for Chris and Nick, on your list of diplomatic asks has been addressing the gross humanitarian abuses that we know have gone on?
Yeah.
I've heard you mention Russia once, but it seems like they're there in the shadows. And can you speak to that?
Okay. So, David,
Sure. What's interesting was that when the president sat down with Chairman Kim, cyber was not on the list, even though when you think about it, cyber is the one way that the North Koreans have actually attacked the United States in recent years repeatedly.
Yeah.
There was the attack on Sony, there was the theft from the Bangladeshi bank, there have been attacks on American financial firms and so forth. And they've gotten increasingly sophisticated. And I think a little bit this was sort of the old think of the administration that, you know, nuclear was the one way they could get at us. And certainly it's the most dramatic, and I would agree the most urgent. If you're the North Koreans, though, you can give away at least part of your nuclear program, and maybe a good deal of it, because you know you can never actually attack the United States with a nuclear weapon, because you'd feel good about that for about 45 minutes, and then you'd probably not feel much. So cyber is going to be a way that they have to keep us a bit off base. And one of the interesting questions about the U.S. program to go destabilize the North Korean missile thing is, does it set a precedent that other countries will use, or the North Koreans could try to use, to get into the command and control systems of our nuclear systems as well? So at some point in these discussions, if we get that far, the North Koreans we're going to have a real cyber conversation with the North Koreans as well.
Yeah. Do you want to speak to the Russian and other?
Yeah, just the two questions. I'll be very brief. Human rights is an obvious concern. North Korea is one of the worst violators of human rights in the world. We haven't had a vehicle to try to influence it because we have no relationship. The Trump administration, I think, has probably been the weakest American administration in the post-World War II era in putting human rights out front as an issue. It has not wanted to talk to anybody about human rights. It's subordinated it. So I think this only comes into play if we make progress on the nuclear front, if we develop a diplomatic relationship with North Korea. Then you have a little bit of influence to say the sanctions that John talked about, maybe some of the sanctions remain until they stop executing people. On Russia, it's not nearly as important to China as a leverage point, potentially, on North Korea, but it's in the neighborhood. It was part of Chris's six-party talks. Putin's objective right now is to undermine and undercut the United States wherever he can. He's been very unhelpful in recent months. He's part of the group that's normalizing relations with North Korea. So it does, my final point, I think it argues that what Secretary Pompeo, whom I respect a lot, and I think he's a very capable person, working for a president who's not effective, so that's difficult. Pompeo needs to widen the group, the negotiation. He needs to consciously bring China and Russia and South Korea back into it in order to get them to try to apply some leverage, because right now, nobody's helping us.
Yeah, and he is going to have trouble. If we have to go back to maximum pressure, we're going to have a lot of trouble getting China and South Korea on board unless they've kind of been at the table with us and see what we're up against. Let me just mention on human rights, back in 2005 when we put together the joint statement, it talked about the U.S. and North Korea normalizing according to their national policies. And national policies was code for the fact that if we ever got to the point where we're sitting down talking about diplomatic relations, we would have a separate channel set up to discuss human rights. And I made that very clear to the North Koreans. I made it very clear to the other 6 party members. I remember our Russian colleague at the time said, what, you don't think this is hard enough dealing with nuclear weapons? You're going to add human rights? The point is, we don't have, when dictatorships come out of the cold for some kind of diplomatic relations, human rights is always riveted in it until this administration, and I completely support Nick's point of view on that. Finally, on humanitarian assistance, I think our country and other countries need to be very clear. If there are starving children, we have a moral obligation to deal with those starving children. And the idea that somehow we can put more pressure on the North Korean regime by denying food to starving children is just unconscionable. The notion that starving children are going to overthrow that regime, no, they're not. And so I think we do need a principled decision that we will support UN food distribution efforts. We will support any food distribution effort where you can monitor what's going on and where the need is greatest, and that can include North Korea at any time, given their inability to deal with floods or other natural causes. So, well, I think we've had a great discussion. I'm not sure we solved it all, but thank you very much. Thank you.